Were you in the crowd that lined the parade route during Pure Water Days in Chippewa Falls in August? Did you wonder about the many references to pure spring water that you saw during that weekend and continue to notice later? For instance, spring water for sale. Street signs with the names like Water, Pump House, and Spring. The label in that beer can collection that said, "Made with water from the Big Eddy Springs." What's behind it all? The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines a spring as a source of supply, especially a source of water issuing from the ground. In an article written for the Centennial Exposition of 1937, Mrs. J. W. Danners noted the experience of her mother, Mrs. Tom Phillips, who came to Chippewa in 1857. If Mother needed a fresh drink of water, she had to go up to the spring where the Presbyterian Church is now. There were no wells dug yet, but there were many lovely springs around the town. 9 years later, when the then 15-year-old Wesley J. Gregg arrived in Chippewa Falls from Elmira, New York, he found that Spring Street from the west end was filled with springs and a swamp under the hill as far east as the courthouse. The courthouse, in the early days, was located on Spring Street in a building which came to be known as the Pine Tree House. When Jacob Leinenkugel and John Miller started the Spring Brewery in 1867, they were brewing their beer with water from a spring on the site. Today that company, now known as the Leinenkugel Brewery, still uses spring water, but it comes from the city water system, which is fed, in part, by water from the Big Eddy Springs. On September 2, 1871, F.X. Schmidtmeyer, the owner of the Schmidtmeyer Brewery, on River Street, purchased 7 acres of land on Duncan Creek for a beer cellar. The site contained a natural cave with a spring which provided the cool temperature necessary for storing the beer. Mr. Schmidtmeyer enlarged the cave, the entrance of which was then guarded by an iron gate. The beer was lowered into the cave through an opening in the ceiling. This cave and its spring are now a part of Irvine Park. The City Water Works was incorporated in June 1885. David Kirk, civil engineer and city surveyor, said in 1889 that all the water provided for domestic use and fire protection in the city came from a series of springs at a horseshoe bend in the river known as the Big Eddy. He also noted that many citizens used water from springs on their premises, elevating it to their houses by hydraulic rams. The spring reputed to be the biggest and most beautiful was the one called Silver, around which the Silver Spring Park was built in 1889. The site became the location of the Wisconsin Home for the Feeble-Minded in 1896. The name was changed to the Northern Wisconsin Colony and Training School in 1923. It is now known as the Northern Wisconsin Center for the Developmentally Disabled. By far, the most famous of the springs was the one on Pound's Farm, which was located on the south side of the Chippewa River. Thaddeus Coleman Pound, state representative, lieutenant governor, congressman, and businessman extraordinaire, discovered what he believed to be the curative power of the water from his spring when he moved to the farm in 1887. Mr. Pound had suffered the pain of rheumatism for some time, but when he moved to the farm, his affliction disappeared. He attributed his recovery to the water from the spring, and that was the beginning of his campaign to bring Pound's mineral spring water and its health-giving properties to the rest of the world. The designation mineral had to be dropped from the name when chemical analysis showed an almost complete lack of minerals in the water. Mr. Pound's grandson, the poet Ezra Pound, had a much more romantic version of the powers of the water. In his narrative poem, The Legend of the Chippewa Spring and Minnehaha, the Indian Maiden, he claimed that Hiawatha won the love of Minnehaha by giving her a drink of water from the spring. Thaddeus Pound together with his children, Homer L. Pound and Florence L. Foote, had incorporated the farm in 1887. He made the farm a showplace. It was a model farm with a vineyard, cellars, barns, fields, trout ponds, driveways, and, of course, the springs. The drive on Pound's farm, called Prospect Drive, was a half-mile in length, from every point of which one of the finest views in any country could be enjoyed. In 1889, the Chippewa Health Club was incorporated with Pound as the principal stockholder. A bottling works was installed, and around the area of the spring, the grounds were made into a park, then called Pound's Park. The spring, according to a newspaper story at the time, has a capacity of 20,000 gallons per day, never varies in volume or temperature, and is absolutely free from surface contamination. The bottling works for the Chippewa Health Club was in action in early 1889. Their advertisement in the Chippewa Herald called attention to the delicious beverage for the table, bars, and clubs. It sold in half gallons for $1.50 per dozen. The Health Club also produced carbonized water and an excellent ginger ale, all made, of course, with water from the Chippewa Spring. At the time the Health Club was organized, plans were made to remodel ex-Governor Pound's house on the corner of Bridge and Cedar Streets for use as a sanatorium. At a later date, another sanatorium building was proposed. Though it was never built, you will find it pictured on the 1905 bird's eye view of Chippewa Falls. The Chippewa Spring Water Company, the successor of the Chippewa Health Club, was based in Chicago, where its products had wide sales. The company was given the contract to supply the needs of Chicago's Marine Hospital in 1892 because of the purity of the water, even though 5 companies had submitted substantially lower bids. The Chippewa Spring Water Company delivered 3 tank cars of water a week before the contract. Later, a 4th car became necessary, making in all 18,000 gallons or 285 barrels of water a week to Chicago. In July 1892, the Chippewa Spring Water Company completed arrangements with the Wisconsin Central Road to furnish all the water used on the dining cars between Chicago and Portland, Oregon. The year 1893 was a difficult one for the company. The bottling works closed in April because of financial trouble. It reopened in a short time, but by December 1893, the company had failed. With new financing, it was able to reopen in 1894. On February 8, 1895, a fire destroyed the bottling works. Mr. Pound, coming to Chippewa from Chicago, declared it was probably a blessing in disguise, as the old bottling works building was not very substantial. It forced them to construct a new building which was placed closer to the railroad tracks, thus making loading of the railroad cars easier. The spring, which had been covered by the old building, was pumped out to rid it of the debris from the fire, and a canopy and fence were placed over and around it. The bottling works was back in operation by the 18th of February, even while awaiting the construction of the new building. By 1897, the Omaha Railroad had built a siding to the bottling works to complement the one on the Wisconsin Central Road already there, and they were constructing tank cars to ship the water to all parts of the United States. The headquarters of the Chippewa Spring Water Company had been in Chicago since 1891. When the corporation, still headed by Thaddeus C. Pound, president, was sold in June 1903, a subtle change could be noted in its name. The deed proclaimed the transfer of the Chippewa Spring Water Company, an Illinois corporation, to the Chippewa Springs Water Company, a Wisconsin corporation. The Chippewa Springs Water Company was based in Chippewa Falls. From that date until 1913, when ownership passed to the Chippewa Springs Corporation of Minneapolis, Minnesota, where the corporation offices are still located. Through the 1920s, the water from the Chippewa Springs was shipped by tank cars and boxcars of bottled water. The water was piped from the springs into 2 glass-lined storage tanks in the basement of the bottling works. From there, it was pumped into the tank cars. or bottled and stacked in cases in the boxcars. The cases of bottled water, 12 half-gallon bottles per case, weighing 90 pounds per case, were stacked 5 cases high in the boxcars. Most shipping now is done by truck, big 18-wheelers. Over the years, the state has regulated the use of the springs. Water may not be sold now unless the spring from which it is taken is cement capped. The water from the original spring, covered by the little spring house, cannot be sold in this way because the spring is not capped. That water is now used for washing purposes and making distilled water. Other springs on the property have been capped to provide spring water. A restriction in the deeds of current landowners in the park plat is that they may not use the land for agricultural or industrial purposes. The restrictions are meant to preserve the springs from possible contamination. The appearance of the area around the Chippewa Springs has changed greatly over the years since Thaddeus Pound's model farm occupied the hilltop above the river in 1887. What was once the Cadott Road is now Park Avenue. This little spring house stood then at the intersection of the road and C Street. C Street was vacated in 1924. Apartment houses now occupy the bluff above it. Where Prospect Drive and Pound's Farm overlook the river, shoppers now scurry through the Chippewa Mall. Where once Thaddeus Pound sat to survey his Chippewa Springs and Pound's Park, trees and brush now obscure the view. The road is no longer quiet. Cars and trucks hurry by. The little spring house has retreated into a nest of trees and greenery. Other springs in the area have been tapped and capped. The quiet, rural life of the place is just a memory. Only the pure, soft, clear spring water remains.